testimony is one of grace. Now in this stairwell, the walls are covered with pictures of your own life, as well as every story in scripture, from Abraham to Moses to Israel's faith being hopeless to David. So many opportunities here for you to love one another. This is very important, very critical, because again, we're dealing with gospel issues here. When I first began my degree programs here at Southern Seminary, I never thought that I would actually get a degree in counseling. I was looking at systematic theology, I was looking at history, I was looking at even preaching, but I never really considered actually getting a degree in counseling. It wasn't until after I did get my degree and then I began counseling that I noticed how much of a need there was within the church for soul care, specifically within that the behind closed doors, if you would. And so fast forward several years, I've been doing Christian counseling for several years now. And there's many things that I've learned as I've been seeking to be a faithful counselor. And one of the things that have stood out to me over the past several years is how much of a lack there is within the church in general as it relates to counseling the traumatized. People who have experienced some sense of deep trauma and that are seeking to live their lives and seeking to fight for joy in the midst of those traumatizing experiences that they have had in their life that have still in many ways haunt them. And when we think about trauma, yes, we do think about even the big categories, people who struggle with post-traumatic stress and other major themes like that. But even then, there is a significant lack regarding the tools that many churches have as it relates to actually caring for people who suffer such things. And when I think about trauma, and specifically those who have been traumatized, I don't necessarily have just those big categories in mind. I think that there can be all kinds of different forms of trauma that people can experience in their lives as they seek to live, as they live within a fallen world, surrounded within fallen societies and cultures and people and relationships. People can experience all kinds of trauma and be seeking to reconcile that trauma within the grand story of their lives and struggle to do so. And as a counselor, one of the things that I think about as I sit with people and as I have people sitting across from me who are sharing with me their deep hurts and their deep pains and experiences that they have undergone, and the fact that many of them have been in the church for years, kind of just flying under the radar, one of the things that comes to my mind is, where is the church in this? How does the church minister to people who have been traumatized? Before I go further, I want to just take a moment to define my terms that I'm using here when I say trauma and traumatized. You see, trauma is an event or an experience that someone has when they've experienced something that has had a deep emotional and psychological effect on them. And so it's an experience that someone has or engages with that leaves a lasting imprint. And the lasting imprint is one of pain. It's one of suffering. It's one of fear even, and it stays with them and it affects them on an emotional level, on a psychological level, and often it carries with them regarding all the other areas of life that they seek to be faithful in. It kind of comes along with them. And when it comes to the desire for joy in the Lord, when it comes to seeking to live a life not carrying various kinds of baggages that inhibit them from living a life of abundance, they have this thing that they carry with them, this thing, again, that we call trauma, these experiences that they've had that has had this lasting impact. Being traumatized is the act of having that. It's a traumatized person is a person who has that kind of baggage, has had some kinds of radical experiences or events that have happened in their life that has affected them in such a deep way that they carry with them the effects of it. It's kind of an emotional or psychological cancer that follows with them, that has left its imprint on them as they seek to live their life, and they kind of carry it with them. I've had many conversations, my wife and I both, if we have sat on our couch and offered people coffee and we're sitting there talking through whatever issues that they're struggling with. And as we're talking through those things, they open up and begin to share their life stories and begin to share their experiences. And you do have two different kinds of people. You have people who have indeed experienced traumatic events, but they're not necessarily traumatized by those traumatic events. They're able to carry on. They're living their life. They recognize what has happened to them, but in many ways, they're just simply moving on. But then you have other people who have not only experienced traumatizing events, or traumatic events, excuse me, but they've actually been traumatized by those events. Those events did not just move on, that those events had such an impact on them that those events kind of are carrying with them. It continues on with them as they seek to live their life, even if it happened 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so when I think about trauma, I'm thinking about those who have experienced everything from sexual abuse to physical abuse, verbal abuse, to even traumatic events of like seeing a loved one die to in a traumatic way, and all those other kinds of things. And I think that in some sense, the church has an understanding. It recognizes that those realities exist. But at the same time, many churches, many pastors lack the capacity to engage with those kinds of issues. Often those kinds of issues are seen as things that are beyond the church, and so they're simply just things that are set apart and people are referred to psychiatrists and psychologists, and people are medicated, and you have all those kinds of things. Or maybe they're cared for. Maybe people seek to counsel and speak into their life, but they do it in a way in which doesn't necessarily bring healing as much as it just allows them to carry on to the next day. But one of the areas of trauma that I think is often neglected and I think in many ways is a non-category in the discussions where we think about traumatization and people who are traumatized is racial trauma, racialized trauma. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to take a moment to share with you what my experiences are as a counselor, as well as even personally, as it relates to issues of racialized trauma. And as I mentioned before, I think that that's an issue, and that's an area that is widely neglected. And I think honestly that even as I say that racialized trauma, that the majority of people who may actually hear this may actually just simply roll their eyes at that statement that I just made, and kind of just laugh under their breath that did he just say racialized trauma? How could there be such thing as racialized trauma? Why does everything have to be about race? And what I would like to do is kind of present to you a narrative, present to you as a counselor and as someone who in many ways has experienced racialized trauma, share with you what that is, how it happens, and where the church can go from there, and more or less. And so when you think about racialized trauma, there's a couple of things that you have to think about here. Racialized trauma, if you're going to think about what does it mean to be racial, what does it mean to be racialized? When you think about race, when you think about racialization, what we're talking about there is acts or things, acts, words, any kind of engagement that someone has in which the experience is motivated or targeted towards race. And so when we think about the concept of race, and specifically talking about race as being biology, that people are of different races, I would use the term ethnicity. And so you could even say ethnic trauma. But when we think about the society we live in, the categories of race exist. The concepts of race being a biological reality and that people are made up of different races is the prevalent worldview in which most people live and move within. And within that, there are experiences and there are in contexts in which someone can experience racialization. That situation where people they're looked at and as they're perceived, and they see their skin color is analyzed, and their backgrounds is analyzed, and their cultural backgrounds are analyzed. That person and how they relate to that person racializes them. And that comes with prejudices, that comes with biases, that comes with maybe microaggressions, and it can even come with various acts. In the news right now, we see various things related to social justice and mass incarceration. And we have documentaries like The 13th that deals with how much of there's a disproportionate reality related to the criminal justice system and how it affects blacks to whites. And what I would argue and I would believe is that there's a racialization that exists within the legal system where black people are seen as being more threatening and seen as being in many ways criminalized, and the criminalizing of black people is a form of racialization. And so when we think about even slavery, for example, slavery is an act of racialization. And it's an act of racialization that had led to racialized trauma. You have people who were kidnapped from their lands, stripped from their cultures and their families, subjugated and treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. And so that they were racialized. They were racialized in the sense of perception of who they are and what is their value based on skin color. They were racialized in the sense of, again, their duties and what they should do, that because they're inferior, they should serve us. And so the racialization exists within perception. I see them as less. It existed in regards to the response to that, which is I'm going to make them my slave and they're going to serve me. And then even when it thinks about socioeconomic realities of what ended up happening with slaves and how they lived their lives and all the abuses and oppression that they experienced, all those things are racializations that happen. And when you think about the racialization that happened to black slaves, what you end up having is a group of people, specifically black slaves, who have experienced racialized trauma. They've experienced traumatic events that carry with them throughout their lives that are deeply rooted in race and racialization. When you think about Jim Crow, when you think about the whole civil rights movement, and you think about the people who, black people specifically, who had to live in a way in which they constantly recognized that they were in danger. That even if they're seen as smiling at a white woman could end up costing them their lives and even being tortured, as you see with Emmett Till. And they knew that they were always a step away from being hanged. More or less, and that their lives could be taken from there and justified by police because, again, they were still seen as less. And so you have an entire people group who are living their lives recognizing that society sees them as less than, and that they are inferior, and they are inferior because of their skin color, and they're perceived as ugly, they're perceived as not valuable, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of those things are, again, racializations, and all of those things lead to racialized trauma for those who have to actually experience it. One of the challenges that happens in the church is the fact that many people, specifically within the majority culture, have not experienced racialized trauma. Now, there are some who have. I have spoken to, and I know personally, white people who have grown up even though they're part of the majority culture, they have grown up in minority contexts, and they've experienced racism. They've experienced oppression and marginalization. And so they carry with themselves a form of racialized trauma as they have been isolated and they have been made to feel inferior as they are surrounded by a minority culture that's a majority within their context. And so racialized trauma is not something that's simply exclusive to black people, African Americans. It's something that all people can experience, and all peoples of different hues do experience regarding in different contexts. But the problem is that when you speak of something where the majority culture, specifically even in the church, does not have any way to understand or grasp because it's not something that they have had to experience or engage with, then you can be seen as someone who is overreacting, someone who's making everything about race, or someone who's blowing something out of proportion. And what we are seeing, and what I have seen in the past years as a counselor, as I've had many conversations with minorities, specifically minorities in the church, I have lost track of how many hours of counseling I have done seeking to care for those who have experienced racialized trauma. And one of the dynamics there with this racialized trauma is that the church itself has been responsible not only in perpetuating it, but also in intensifying it due to its indifference to the reality that this kind of trauma exists. I can give you many examples. Let's go back a few years, and we've already talked about slavery. We already talked about Jim Crow, and we can even talk about the situation that happened when Obama became president. You see, a lot of minority people groups saw specifically black people when it came to Obama, but minority groups in general are very communal in nature. And what I mean by that is when one person succeeds within that people group, it is a success for all. They see it as this person is a representative of us. They're an ambassador of us. And so when they succeed, that whole people rejoices. And so you can have various cultures. I have some friends from the Dominican Republic who, if you ever see someone from the Dominican Republic get drafted into professional baseball, it's like the whole DR is celebrating because it's like, hey, one of us have made it. When you think about someone like Obama becoming president, when a black man achieving that level of success, that level of notoriety, that level of power and even authority, for the African American community, it was as if we received this. This man is a representative of us and what is possible for us. He's a symbol of hope, for us. But what happened in much of Protestantism, specifically within evangelicalism, when Obama became president, was nothing but constant degrading statements made towards Obama, a constant tearing him down and criticizing him and making monkey memes and just constantly just doing nothing but talking about how evil he is and how he's evil incarnate. And what ended up happening there, though much of that was motivated by political biases, what ended up happening was you had black people in the church looking at their white brethren and how they were tearing down this person who was a representative of their own hope and their own success of oppressed people, and they took it personally. And so for those people who have experienced, specifically black people, who know intimately what it's like to be deprived of power, to be deprived of authority, to be deprived of success, to be perceived as uneducated, to be perceived as someone who's going to go to jail, and that's basically going to be their life, is they're more likely to go to jail than college. Someone who's heard those kinds of statements and who's lived under this constant gaze of being less than, when they see someone who is a representative of themselves, then receive that and they're celebrating with them, and then you tell them that this person is inferior, that this person is less than, what they are experiencing is that trauma. What they are experiencing is you are reawakening the events and the experiences that they have had to deal with and had to engage with throughout their life, and it stirs up in them a pain. A deep pain, because it's specifically within the church, when it's the church that is supposed to be there to love and walk and to live with them in an understandable way. A more recent example would be the whole Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I don't personally endorse the actual movement itself, or let me rephrase that, the actual organization itself, but I do support the hashtag, and I do believe that it's a valid hashtag. I think America is a country that is constantly demonstrating how much value or lack thereof it places on Black life, and so when you're in a context where you have yourself experienced abuse of power by the hands of police, when you have been racialized by police and by the legal system, and you've been abused, you've been beaten, you've been threatened, you have had your life threatened, and all those kinds of things, and you in your own heart feel like your life doesn't matter as a black person, and you're constantly living every day in this posture where my life is not valued, and you have life experiences that validate that concern or that tension, and other people within the church, specifically people within the majority culture of the church, are telling you that that's ridiculous, that it's not that big of a deal, that you're overreacting, that you're being a liberal, and just coming up with all these different excuses to not validate your concern for your life. And you have in yourself experienced racialization as it relates to police and as it again relates to the legal system. That stirs in you, that only enhances the trauma that a person has experienced, the racialized trauma that a person of color has experienced throughout their life. And so what I've experienced as a Christian counselor, specifically over the past year, is countless cases of black people specifically, but also Hispanic and even Asian for that matter, who have a history of trauma and racialization, specifically trauma related to being racialized, and the pain and the hurt that they have wrestled with and in many ways have fought tooth and nail to try to subdue, have all of a sudden become bursting forth and coming forth due to the insensitivity of others. And I know as I'm saying this, one of the dangers right now is that I can anticipate someone saying race being racialized is not that big of a deal. And what I can say to that is the only person who could think that way, that being racialized or racialization does not lead to trauma or is not a traumatic experience, is people who have the privilege of never actually being racialized. To have the experience of your worth and your life and your dignity being rejected of you because of your skin color, something that cannot be changed. And to not only have that happen once, but to live a life where that is the perpetual reality in which you have to live and move within. And it's constantly coming up. It's constantly, every single day, you are awakened by that reality that you are less than because of your skin color. That has an effect that is deep. And most people, specifically in the majority culture, have no idea, no capacity even to understand the trauma that comes with racialization, because they've never been racialized. Now, again, I know white people who have been racialized, who do understand the pain of what it means to be racialized, because they've experienced it growing up as a majority, someone from the majority culture within a minority culture context, and have been racialized within that context, and all the things that come with it. But most people, and this is one of the things, is that I don't have to be sexually abused in order to validate the trauma that is caused when someone is sexually abused. If I sit on my couch and I am talking to a sister or brother who has been sexually abused, and they are sharing with me the pain and the hurt and the trauma of that experience or experiences, and they're weeping on my couch and they're just pouring their hearts out on my couch, I can empathize with that pain, with that hurt, and their experiences can validate that trauma without me having to actually experience it firsthand. If I am sitting on the couch with a brother who has served overseas in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they have seen their friends blown to pieces, and they are struggling with the realities of why they're still alive and all their friends are dead, and they are sharing with me all the horrors of what they've seen overseas in a war, in a war-torn country, and all the experiences and the traumatic experience that was for them, I don't have to be a soldier in that context and experience the same thing to validate the trauma. The fact of the matter is that their experience and their hurt and pain validates it for me. I don't have to ask all the questions of whether or not, what are the statistics that demonstrate the validity of this person's traumatization. The fact of the matter is statistics is not going to convince somebody that their trauma is non-existent or that they're overreacting. Because when you understand what trauma is, that trauma is an event or it's a situation that happens to somebody that deeply affects them on an emotional and a psychological level, and it's deeply painful. It's not something that's surface, but it's a deeply ingrained pain. Then you know that simply quoting stats is not going to alleviate it. That something deeper is necessary, and I think that there are answers for that, which I'll get to in a second. But it's similarly as in those situations when it comes to racialized trauma, someone should not have to experience racialization in order to validate the actual traumatization that one experiences when they have. And I think one of the challenges that we can often have within the church is this challenge where in order to have empathy, I must walk in that person's shoes. Because then we don't have empathy when we lack the capacity to walk in that person's shoes. Empathy is not developed through walking in another person's shoes. Empathy is developed when someone is abounding in love and is willing to sit down with another person and hear the stories of where their shoes have been. You don't have to walk in a person's shoes as much as have a willingness to listen to where a person has traveled. And when you hear where a person has gone in their shoes, and if you've walked alongside them in their story, and you are seeking to abound in love, then empathy is the direct result of that. Concern and compassion and love and charity and grace, all of those things are the fruits of hearing others' stories and being able to identify with them as brothers and sisters in Christ. Not having to identify with them in the actual trauma itself or in the actual experiences themselves. And so one of the great struggles with the church, specifically as it relates to racialized trauma, is that most churches that are majority culture, predominantly white churches, they lack the capacity to understand racialization. But they lack the capacity on two fronts. They lack the capacity just providentially because that they live within a culture that prioritizes whiteness, and so they do not, and people of whiteness have the power and have the authority, and so they don't necessarily experience on a grand scale racism and the effects of racism. But on the other hand, they don't understand because they don't have black voices and they're not listening to the voices of the racialized. And so because they lack the capacity, or they lack the context, or they lack the the skin tone, if you would, to identify with being racialized, and they lack the willingness to listen to racialized voices, they are inept in understanding and being able to walk with and being able to love and engage people who have experienced racialized trauma. Now, there's another dynamic to this. People who have been racialized are not the only people who experience racialized trauma. It's also those who have walked alongside those who have experienced racialized trauma, who are marginalized by the majority, who have not, who also experience it. Let me explain what I mean by that. When someone truly gives their heart to another, when someone is truly abounding in love towards another person, they become vulnerable. They empty themselves out and they empty it into another person. They give of themselves. That's what love is. Love is a giving of oneself to another person. And when someone is abounding in love, and in their love they are with and they are empathetic to the racially traumatized, and as they are connecting on a deep level with those who have experienced racialized trauma, they look at their friends, their family, their neighbors, their churches, who are completely indifferent to the racialized traumas of those whom they now identify with, those whom they now feel for. And they themselves begin to feel that deep sense of betrayal, that deep sense of isolation. They themselves begin to feel an aspect of trauma that is caused by the loneliness and the solitude and the engagements that happen of feeling like everyone else, when you identify with something and you're expecting the people who you love to actually join you in loving another, and you see that they don't, that affects you deeply as well. And that has an enormous impact on someone when they are abounding in love and other people are not abounding in love towards them by being willing to love what they love. In this case, other people who are suffering because of racialization. And so what you end up having, and this is something that I've experienced on numerous occasions, is I've counseled minorities who have experienced racialized trauma and are seeking to deal with the pain and hurt of that while they are living and moving within a context that has no compassion for them. And then on the other side, I have had white people sitting on my couch weeping in agony, emotional agony, because they so deeply love their black and brown brothers and sisters, and they so deeply understand and identify with their pain, and they are so deeply hurt because no one else does. They feel like they are alone. They are alone. When they want their white brothers and sisters to come love alongside them, many of them are demonstrating indifference, and so they themselves feel this deep, deep sense of pain and this deep sense of hurt that that others that whom they love would not cross the aisle with them to love others. And so they end up becoming many times just as devastated and just as discouraged and just as broken as those who actually have experienced racialized trauma. And this isn't just with race. This happens with everything. If you are a counselor, or if you are someone who is walking alongside someone who has experienced sexual abuse, and you have heard their story and you deeply, deeply feel their pain, and then you see other people, especially those who are supposed to be part of your covenant family of God, the covenant family of God, indifferent to that person's pain, that you would feel the same exact level of hurt and the same exact level of betrayal and deep feelings, even psychological feelings of distrust and pain. Same thing goes with those of physical abuse. If so, a woman is beaten by her husband and you're her best friend and you're walking alongside her, and someone else who hears about the assault is just indifferent to that woman, your friend's pain, it hurts you deeply, especially if that person is someone whom you've also become vulnerable with and who've poured out love towards. And so what ends up happening is ultimately disunity in the church. You have one group of people in the church that are indifferent to racialized trauma. You have other people who have experienced racialized trauma. And then you have people in between who have poured out their love on both, and they cannot understand why the people they've loved over here is so indifferent to the other people that they're loving over here. Why can't there be this triune love, if you would, between the people of God? And so when I think about racialized trauma, what I think about is not just simply the experiences that some people have had, that specifically minorities have had, but I also think about the dynamics of the people who've loved them and the hurt and the pain that they feel that others aren't joining them in their love. So allow me to kind of lay out to you some of the experiences when I talk about racialized trauma. I know I've been spending a lot of time using the term trauma and trauma and trauma, and I want to take a moment to just explain to you specifically, as I guess you could say more of a case study to what I am talking about. One of the primary things that I've experienced as a counselor over the past year or so, a little bit longer than that, is in response to the various shootings that have taken place on national television or on social media, where people who have seen those shootings have they have triggered more or less something psychologically and emotionally within people who have seen those shootings. Often there are people who have experienced abuse of power, racialized abuse of power at the hands of police officers themselves who have now witnessed those shootings. And then what ends up happening is there's a connection that they make between their experiences to the experiences that they are now seeing. Specifically, unarmed black bodies being killed and publicly their deaths publicly displayed to the masses, which triggers something in them that causes them to relive their experiences, but with a different narrative, as if what would happen to them if this would have happened to them. And so in some sense, they connect their own experiences to the experiences that they've seen on television with such a deep level that they end up reliving their experience, but in their experiences they relive it as if they had their own brush of death. Now, this is in addition to the brush of death that they actually had. So again, in these situations, they feared for their lives as they were racialized by the police, and their police abused their power. So that in that moment, they felt their life was threatened. But then they begin living that experience through the communal reality of seeing someone who looks like them experience that, and this leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. What I would like to do is kind of, as for sake of explanation here, I've pulled up the National Center for PTSD. This is the government. This is an actual government site that diagnoses PTSD according to the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for that psychiatrists and psychologists use to determine various disorders, psychological disorders. And listen to this. There's several different functions that are criteria that are necessary to be met in order for someone to qualify as suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Here's the first one. Criteria A. The person was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in the following ways: direct exposure, witnessing the trauma, learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to the trauma; indirect exposure to aversive details of the trauma, usually in the course of professional duties like first responders or medics. I know many black people who all fit 3 out of those 4 criteria. I pretty much, every member of my family that I know, on the black side of my family, has had an experience with police where they felt their life was threatened. I actually had a conversation with my family. We had a family reunion recently, and we actually spent a few hours going through our histories and telling the stories that all of us have had with police officers. This was after one of the recent shootings that took place, and so I have, me myself. Every family member that I know that is African American has had some level of direct exposure in which they felt that they were threatened with death or serious bodily harm. Many of them have witnessed trauma. If they have not experienced it themselves, they have been present as a friend was assaulted by police, and or been assaulted due to racialization, or a family member, maybe even a father, or maybe they've lost a parent, because of these kinds of things. And finally, learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to this trauma. It is really hard to find an African American who has not experienced or knows someone on a deep and personal level who has experienced severe racialization, that has led to death, the threat of death, or the threat of serious bodily harm. And so for that first criteria, there are many people within congregations, specifically African Americans within congregations, who have experienced 3 out of 4 of those criteria. Yet the DSM-5 says only 1 is required for post-traumatic stress disorder in that first category, in that first criteria A. Let's move on. Criteria B. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in the following way: intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress after exposure to traumatic reminders, physical reactivity after exposure to traumatic reminders. And so think about this for a second. What it's basically saying there, and again, I know many people, and I have sat and counseled many people, specifically African Americans, who have actually, it says here that, let's see, only 1 of these is required in this category for as we move along this criterion for post-traumatic stress. Again, there is a total of, looks like 5, 6, 7, looks like maybe about 8 different criteria. And each have about 4 categories. 1 in each of these categories have to be met in order for it to continue along the cycle to determine post-traumatic stress disorder. You have here in criterion B, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress after exposure to traumatic reminders, physical reactivity after exposure. Now, I know at least, I've counseled many people who have experienced at least 4 out of the 5 of the criteria in criterion B. They have had intrusive thoughts. It bombards their mind, and part of this is the reality that these black deaths are constantly replaying in social media and in the news, and we are constantly reliving these deaths that have happened at the hands of police abusing power, or even if that's not the case, even if the police have not abused power at all, just visually seeing black bodies dying on TV that are unarmed trigger these thoughts, and then constantly playing through the minds of people who themselves have experienced or know people personally who have experienced racialized events in which their life has been in jeopardy, or at least is felt in jeopardy. Nightmares. People waking up in cold sweats, having perpetual nightmares of these experiences, or experiences of what could have happened if things would have been different, and so losing severe lack of sleep. Flashbacks, constantly flashbacking, being reminded and going back to the event and reliving those events in their life, every day, just constantly reliving those events. No matter how hard they try to ignore them, they constantly come back. Emotional distress after exposure to traumatic reminders. So there can be triggers, and when these triggers take place, people are reminded about the racialization. They are reminded about, what happened and what occurred in their life, and so they begin reliving that when certain triggers are happening. And these triggers can even be things that their white brothers and sisters post on social media. There can be triggers when someone posts something that shows a severe insensitivity towards the things that that black people are struggling with, that can trigger these emotional responses and this reliving this emotional trauma. And then finally, even physical. There can be physical reactivity, breaking out in cold sweats, shaking, and you're not being able to control your hands or your body, and all those kinds of things. Even in some cases, maybe even being so overcome with the traumatic experience that one becomes kind of catatonic. That also has happened. We move on to criterion C, trauma-related thoughts, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the trauma, in the following way: trauma-related thoughts or feelings, trauma-related reminders. So people who do everything they possibly can to not put themselves into a position where they're going to be triggered. Many people don't recognize this, but black people actually attending majority culture churches can be a trigger, especially if those majority culture churches are churches that have a reputation for being very pro-Republican, and there's so much more that I could go into in regards to that, but I want to move on here and go to criterion D: negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsen after the trauma. They give several examples: inability to recall key features of the trauma, selective amnesia, overly negative thoughts and assumptions about oneself or their ward, and so beginning to have reoriented to a negative perspective of oneself, exaggerated blame of self or others for causing the trauma. So they begin to think that it's their blackness, it's their fault for being black that is the result of this trauma. Decreased interest in activities, feeling isolated, difficulty experiencing positive effect. Most of the cases of post-traumatic stress, only one of these are required, but in my experience, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all 7 of those are present within people whom I have done soul care alongside, who are struggling with cases of PTSD due to racialization. We can go to criterion E: irritability or aggression, risky or destructive behavior, hypervigilance, heightened startle reaction, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. And then the other criteria just deal with longevity. How long does it last? It has to last for more than a month. It can cause to social, occupational distress and functionality, and so people cannot work their jobs, and they begin to not be able to engage socially with other people. It affects them on that deeper level, and then it can even lead to ultimately symptoms on that, and all these symptoms are not due to any kind of medication or substance abuse, so no drug abuse, but these are the realities in which one experiences. Now, that's just dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want you to understand that racialized trauma, not just simply Black Lives Matter, or not just simply racialized trauma related to law enforcement, but there are numerous experiences that can happen in a black person's life that leads them to all of these things. Post-traumatic stress disorder is very, very common amongst people who struggle with racialized trauma. And if you know anyone who has struggled with, and typically it doesn't necessarily manifest itself the same way that, say, someone who struggles with PTSD who's coming back from Afghanistan may struggle with it. It can look differently, but these are the internal turmoils that are happening in someone's heart who is a victim of racialized trauma. Now, I want to be transparent with you all. Since July, the first week in July, when there were 2 shootings that took place there. One man was shot in his car with his daughter in the back seat and his girlfriend or wife, driving the vehicle. And then another black man was killed with his arms up facing his vehicle, and he was shot down, and we all showed it on Facebook. I was one of the guys who was actually watching those killings live. Specifically, the first one, I was live on Facebook and I saw it unfolding, and that triggered something in me. I have honestly been struggling with PTSD for the past several months, and in light of that event, and it's been extremely trying, and it's been a great struggle. And as a biblical counselor, when you counsel people who struggle with these things, and then you find yourself in the place where you are now struggling with the very thing that you're counseling other people how to overcome. That's been my life for the past several months, since last July. So it's almost been a year now since I've begun struggling with most of the stuff that's listed here, and several in each category. And these things are very, very common. And so when I speak of trauma, I'm talking about trauma that can be even proven clinically, and I'm talking about trauma that is deep, and yeah, and it goes across the spectrum. And so I wanted to just share that with you. And so I've had people on my couch who have struggled with PTSD. I have had people and due to racialized trauma. I have had people on my couch. I've had white people on my couch who have struggled with racialized trauma as they've lived in black or minority communities, and they've been racialized, and they've been torn down and broken down, and they struggle with issues of self-esteem. Now, I'm not talking about a worldly sense of self-esteem. I'm talking about a sense of self-worth, that they are made in the image of God. I'm not talking about this kind of self-esteem that you're going to get where you need to just think better of yourself. I'm talking about seeing themselves as human, seeing themselves as people that were actually made in the image of God, struggling with understanding any kind of capacity that God could actually love them, not because they are sinners, but because they feel a sense of a lack of humanity, within themselves, as they blame themselves for the trauma that they've received, and they, in some sense, even believe some of the racializations that have occurred. And so, the trauma that I'm talking about here is very, very deep, and it goes very deep. And the triggers, the things that can actually trigger the kind of trauma that I'm talking about, is multifaceted, and often happens by well-meaning Christians, who post things on social media. And so I've been very vocal about the whole Trump dynamic, and even encouraging people not to, on social media, broadcast that they're voting for Trump, because that can be a trigger to people who are struggling with racialized trauma, specifically struggling with racialized trauma and even PTSD, as it can trigger back memories as you hear Trump say things like law and order and various other kinds of things that have had historical negative consequences within minority communities. I have a brother, a close friend of mine, who ministers to Hispanic youth in California, and he's told me about the racialized trauma that he is having to minister amongst, as you have all these kids who have heard Donald Trump say, basically call all Hispanics rapists and murderers, and just talk about deporting them, and they are literally traumatized as they in fear, and they can't sleep, and they wake up in cold sweats as they're thinking about being deported and about their parents being deported, even though their parents are legal, and they're constantly under this deep cloud of fear, and this deep sense of nobodiness that is perpetuated through various policies and various beliefs of that have been taking place on even social media. And many churches reinforce that as they reaffirm their belief being anti-immigration and all those other kinds of things that come with that. I've counseled people who are from Syria and people from the Middle East, and how they have experienced trauma in light of various immigration issues, and the way that white Christians have responded and affirmed a strong and sturdy stand on immigration, and they feel like the white people do not want them there, and do not love them, and do not care for them, and many white people don't realize that the way in which they speak can be a trigger for those people who have experienced racializations by growing up in a predominantly Muslim country. And so all of these things, and there's so much more. I don't want to get too long-winded, with this podcast episode, but there is so many things and so many examples that I can give of tangible trauma. I'm not talking about some mythological experience or emotional experience here. I'm talking about genuine and real, deeply seated trauma that people have experienced and suffer with because of a history of and a past that deals with extreme racialization. And I'm going to go ahead and transition on here, but I hope that you're understanding my point there and what I'm seeking to present to you here. Now, there's some unique aspects to racialized trauma that I haven't touched on yet. I think one of the most difficult forms of trauma to keep people from is racialized trauma. Follow me with this here. When it comes to the trauma that is caused through sexual abuse, to a great degree, there's much you cannot do. Again, sexual abuse happens by loved ones, by teachers, by people, just all across the board. And you can do everything that you can, and to a certain extent, you can guard your children, you can watch your children, you can monitor your children, you can monitor their friendships, you can monitor their engagement with adults, you can do all those things. And so there's a lot that you can do to build up barriers around your children in hopes to avoid them from experiencing trauma, sexual abuse, and even physical abuse. And various other kinds of trauma. And you can actually be successful in doing that. You can actually successfully avoid sexual and physical trauma of your children. Now, when I say you can be successful, I don't mean that there's a failure on the part of a parent if somehow something falls to the crack or something happens. I'm not going there. What I'm simply saying is that there is a possible bubble that you can put your children within, and yes, it may rob them of experiences in life and all those other kinds of things, and you can measure whether or not that's appropriate to do this, that, and the other, and if your children are really living life, if you're taking that away from them. But there is a tangible possibility of raising children in such a fortified structure that they do not experience sexual abuse and physical abuse. In fact, most people in life do not experience those kinds of trauma. When it comes to racialized trauma, how do I keep my children from it? Every single black parent that I know has had to have a talk with their children about what it means to be black in America. In order to preserve my child's life, in order for me to ensure that my child lives past 12 and isn't identified at 12 as he's holding a water gun in his hand as being a threat and being shot down. But the only way that I can ensure my child is able to live and move within a racialized world where he is the object of racialization is if I prepare him for the sins of our society, specifically the racialization that our society is so steeped in. And so in order to preserve my son's life, and my daughter for that matter, I have to introduce them to the very thing that traumatizes. I have to make sure that my son is aware that his skin color means certain things. It means that there are some things that he can do and there's some things that he cannot do. I have to reinforce to my daughter the inherent beauty that she has as being an image bearer as she lives through life, and there will be people who will judge her beauty based upon the complexion of her skin. And my children are mixed; they're light skinned. They're black, but they're multi-ethnic. That's not even including the entirely black family whose daughters are being raised and who are actually dark-skinned, and sons are being raised who are actually dark-skinned, and in many ways are perceived way more threatening, perceived way more threatening than my children will be perceived. But the black family cannot afford not to introduce their children to racialization, because not doing so may cost their children their very life. And so when we consider every other form of trauma, one of the things that we have to consider is the fact that racialized trauma is unavoidable for the minority. The black and brown person cannot but help experience racialized trauma. Now, there are a few, black and brown people who grow up within majority culture contexts who may not be aware of and may not have to be aware of the dynamics related to their ethnic, identity, and so they live their life and they have various privileges and all those kinds of things. When we think about the massive majority of black and brown people, the massive majority of black and brown people struggle with racialized trauma. This isn't something where it's not a minority expression within the church. The large majority of minorities that you would meet, black and brown minorities that you meet, are experiencing and seeking to work through racialized trauma. It varies in degree. between people. Some people, it can be more intense. Other people, it can be less intense. But for the most part, most minorities in America, this is a form of trauma that all of them are experiencing. And the church has absolutely no idea it even exists. And so when we think about the issues of ethnic reconciliation, when we wonder, well, why can't the church be united? Why is it the black church? Why is it the white church? Why is there still division and all those kinds of things? One of the dynamics there is the reality that most black people, especially, but minorities in general, but especially most blacks, are living with racialized trauma that the white church doesn't even acknowledge exists, let alone has any capacity to actually be empathetic towards. And they wonder why people who are struggling with such trauma are not part of their churches. And the answer to that is quite simply, their churches are not a safe place if someone is suffering from trauma. So again, another example, someone who has experienced sexual abuse, say a woman who has experienced sexual abuse, she will not find a patriarchal church to be a safe place for her. You following that? Someone who is experienced physical abuse may not find a church that is extremely dogmatic about corporal punishment for children to be a safe place. Specifically, corporal punishment in the sense of whips and belts and sticks and all those other kinds of things. There's various forms of trauma that people can experience, and the last thing that the most unhealthy thing for them as they're seeking to heal is to place themselves into a context which is insensitive to not only insensitive to the trauma, but actually perpetuates it. And when we think about evangelicalism and the majority culture church, and you think about even things such as Donald Trump and the rise of him and his ideology, there are many black people who have experienced racialized trauma they do not feel safe within churches who are operating out of those ideologies. For the church that does not see someone like Trump as racist, or does not flinch when they hear words like law and order, to the black person who's experienced racialized trauma and may even have a family member who's in prison because of that law and order or war on drugs, that has a completely different impact on them. And to place themselves in a context that celebrates that kind of language, when that kind of language stirs in them the realities of the trauma that they've experienced and the emotional effects of that, it's unhealthy for them to be in that context. And so one of the things that affects, and this goes across the board. I mean, I could literally have an entire episode here dealing with all kinds of trauma. I could say the same thing about those who've experienced sexualized trauma, verbal trauma, physical trauma, and then other kinds of traumatic events as well. All of this plays into that, where if churches are not a safe place for the traumatized will not find themselves in those churches. Because when the church is supposed to be a refuge for hurting people and people who are in emotional and psychological pain, if the church is not that, but rather that thing that actually perpetuates the pain, then people will not find themselves there. They will look for other outlets. They will look for other means in order to find healing. But if the church is a place where people are able to go and actually be loved and actually be cared for and actually be listened to and actually understood, and people seek to genuinely walk alongside them and carry their burdens and identify with them and even be willing to lay down aspects of privilege so that they can better walk with and identify with them. If the church is that place, then the church is a safe place for those who have experienced trauma, especially trauma that's related to racialization. And when I think about these issues, the main thing that comes to my mind is the fact that most of the people that I know who experience racialized trauma are not in the church. Many of them may find their way to a black church, which has always been historically a place for the marginalized and the oppressed, and a haven for those who have indeed experienced racialized trauma. But then there are other groups that end up actually becoming more appealing to these people. I did a podcast episode a while back, and it's actually here on the YouTube channel as well as on my podcast on iTunes on the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, and I called it the Gospel of the Black Hebrew Israelites and the Gospel of the Racial Divide. And what I talk about there is how the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, which is a cult, seeks to reach intelligent young black men who have experienced racialized trauma. That's their ambition. That's the people who they target. And they target those people because they know that the church isn't offering the refuge that those people need. And so they offer that refuge in an ideology that builds up and encourages the racially traumatized and also makes them look at those who have racially traumatized them as being the enemy. And so you have that, you have Egyptology, and you have various other cults and traditions that black people, and even Islam for that matter, that are found as being appealing because they answer and offer healing to racialized trauma that the church is not willing to offer and is not a safe place to, because it is still in a state of denying the very existence of that thing. And so the answer for the church, where the church must go once it understands and embraces the reality of racialized trauma, is seeking to think through what does it mean to care for and love the traumatized. And when it comes to issues related to the racially traumatized, what does it mean to truly love and care for those who have experienced racial trauma? And how do we correct and how do we help the healing process for those who have experienced this trauma that has lasted, and for many of them, their entire lifetimes? As again, I believe I was around 9 years old the first time someone called me a nigger. And it was actually my best friend who was white. I was sleeping over at his house, and we got into we kind of were frustrated with each other. So kind of like, being boys, we started calling each other name and making it up. And then he ended up calling me a nigger. And I remember it was the last time that we actually ever met. I remember going home and telling my parents what had happened, and just being utterly hurt by it. And I lacked much of the capacity to understand what the word meant, but I understood that it was a term that was a depreciation of my humanity. And maybe closer to 10, 11 when that happened. I'm pretty sure I was younger than that. But anyways, I was a boy. I was a child the first time I experienced that racialization. And I'm now 32 years old, and I still remember it as yesterday, that night that I was at my friend Johnny's house and he called me a nigger, and the effect that had on my heart, the sinking and the deep pain that it caused my heart as a little boy. And so most people, and that's why especially within this new era where I believe that there's due to the honestly, due to Donald Trump and the ideologies that he brings and the America version of America in which he celebrates, he has in many ways unleashed a lot of sleeping racists. A lot of racism used to be something that was seen as culturally disapproving, or it was seen as cultural taboo, if you would. And Donald Trump came on the scene and repopularized racism. He made it normal. And so you have people like Bill O'Reilly, you have people like Tommy Loren, you have other people who can be blatant racist and it not be a problem. And it's not until other controversial issues come up that they become a problem. And so, but he's normalized racism. And so, in a world where racism is once again becoming normalized, I'm expecting that my children will probably be called racial slurs anytime, any day now. And so, I have to be thinking through these things right now, and thinking through how am I going to help care for my own children as they experience racialized trauma, which they are likely to experience in the very near future. And again, and that goes for others as well. And so this is something that goes back and is dated back and people experience throughout their entire lives. And the church has to be thinking of, when we have people come into our midst, first of all, you should already assume, if you are a white pastor, listen to me here, if you are a white pastor and who desires to have a multi-ethnic congregation, you should expect that the black people who are coming into your congregation are struggling with racialized trauma. They may not. And it's worth having conversations and being pastoral and listening and talking and hearing this story. But when I say that the massive, massive majority of black people have experienced forms of racialized trauma and are still experiencing that, I'm not exaggerating with that. I'm being very, very real when I say that. And the what you don't want to do is be insensitive to that reality. And so you don't want to overthink it to the point where you're projecting. But at the same time, the same way that if I'm dealing with teenage boy, if I was a youth pastor, I'm already assuming that most of the men within my youth ministry probably struggle with pornography. And so that's going to be something that I'm sensitive to as I seek to do soul care. Likewise, if you're going to do soul care and you're a white pastor who is seeking to have a multi-ethnic church, as you have minorities come in there, you need to be sensitive to this. You need to be sensitive to it in the counseling room as well as in the pulpit. You need to be utterly careful with what you share on social media. Just recently, they had that scenario where the Asian man on the United Airlines, he's Vietnamese, was assaulted, and my wife is Vietnamese. And I have dear friends who have expressed the desire to have multi-ethnic churches, who essentially said on social media, "Hey, that Asian guy got what he deserved because this is the law, A, B, and C." And I'm sitting here like, you guys honestly have no idea what racialized trauma is. Do you think that the Vietnamese person who identifies with this person because, again, they're communal culture, this is a Vietnamese man, so he's one of us, who sees that and sees the abuse that has taken place, is taking the time to read points A, B, and C of the legal code for the United Airlines? Do you think the black person who has experienced racialization is looking at that and is going to see and click on your link to see the laws and the rules and regulations for United Airlines? No, what they're going to see is you saying they got exactly what they deserved. And what's going to happen is a deep, deep sense of pain is going to flood that person's mind as well as that person's emotions. And you're going to lose them. They're going to literally be afraid of you. And so one of the dynamics that we don't understand is this whole concept of safe space. I hope I don't go on a tangent with this, but it's something that deeply grieves me as I see a lot, specifically my white brothers who constantly want to critique liberals and saying, "Oh, they need the safe space, they need this safe space, they need this safe space," not realizing that the very concept of the very antagonism towards the concept of a safe space can only be held by those who've never actually needed it. That it's actually white privilege that speaks antagonism towards that concept. Now, I do believe that people can exaggerate the concept of a safe space. But I also believe that people who have been traumatized need a safe space. I've done enough Christian biblical counseling to know that one of the greatest struggles that happens with those who have been traumatized is one of the reasons why they struggle deeply alone and often struggle with severe and even sometimes suicidal depression is because they feel like they don't have a safe space to express and share their pain. And so they don't have a place where they feel like if they share what has happened to them, that the men in the room are going to actually be sympathetic towards them. Or sometimes even the women in the room. And so when I think about categories of safe space, I recognize that people who have been emotionally and psychologically traumatized absolutely need a place where they feel safe to be able to open up that vulnerability, because if it's not received, then all that happens is the pain and the agony and the hurt that they've experienced that has caused their trauma is only going to intensify. And so the extent of vulnerability that is expressed through someone being traumatized, actually being willing to share and talk about their traumatization is heavy. And there's a need for a safe space. And so when we say, is your church a safe place for the racially traumatized? That is a legitimate question. And if you are a pastor, you should, or even a layperson, that's a question that you should really consider. Is my church a safe place for the racially traumatized? Is my church a safe place for the sexually abused and traumatized? Is my church a safe place for the physically abused and traumatized? Is my church a safe place who has experienced traumatization by their family, by being disowned by their family and being ridiculed and slandered by their loved ones because they came to Christ? Those kind of, when you think about traumatization, is your church a safe place? Is your home a safe place? This I don't want to not mention this, but even when it comes to those who struggle with homosexual sin, is your church and is your home a safe place for them? Because best believe that homosexuality is a sin that comes with traumatization. The trauma that can take place with family, the trauma that can take place with friendships, the trauma that can take place within society where, yes, the mainstream media may have embraced homosexuality, but it's still very much taboo within culture often. And so the amount of pain and insults and injury that can happen to people who struggle with homosexuality or even engulfed in homosexual sin is severe. Is your church and is your home a safe place for the sexually traumatized, regardless of what form it takes, whether it's abuse, whether it's sexual sin, whether it's adultery, whether it's whatever the categories is related to that? And I think that one of the things that we will find is that many of our churches are not safe places. And one of the reasons why there's antagonism towards the language of a safe place is because churches realize that they're not that. And so, to kind of wrap things up now, my chief desire, even in this own podcast, is one, I want to raise awareness to the fact that racialized trauma does exist and what racialized trauma is, as well as the need for the church to actually really take it seriously and really seek to love those who have experienced such a thing. And when we recognize that even Jesus himself has experienced, there is no trauma that Christ himself has not experienced personally. Jesus has experienced physical trauma. He experienced the trauma of sexual exploitation or sexual objectification. What do I mean by that? He was nailed to a cross on a public road, completely naked, before his mother, before his women disciples, before the populace and everything else. There he is hanging on a tree, completely naked. He was objectified physically. His body was physically objectified, and sexually shamed, if you would, as a grown adult man being nailed to a cross naked. And he was racially traumatized. Jesus himself was. He was racially traumatized in the sense of he was being crucified by the Roman government, who saw him as nothing more than a dirty Jew. Best believe that any racial slurs that were used towards the Jews of that time, that those were heard at him as he was being mocked. As he was being mocked with the crown of thorns, as he was being mocked with the purple cloak, as he was being mocked by having Inri placed over his head, king of the Jews. His crucifixion was a racialized event. It was even racialized as he was rejected by his own people. The Jews did not want him. They did not want to have anything to do with him. They rejected his Jewishness. And so Jesus was racially traumatized on that cross. On the cross, Jesus himself experienced racial traumatization. And so he is the faithful high priest. He is the intercessor who has experienced all the trials and all the trauma that we have experienced. He himself has taken on, and that includes racial trauma. And so, Christians, as pastors and preachers and ministers and counselors, we can connect racialized trauma to Christ. And we can point those who have experienced racialized trauma to their Savior and let them know that, hey, he took this on as well. That he is your sympathetic high priest. He knows intimately not only your racialized trauma, but he knows intimately because he experienced racialized trauma. When it comes to the objectified, and that objectification can take place in regards to sexual objectification, to physical objectification, to verbal objectification, all those things Christ himself took on. He experienced those things intimately, and so he can relate to the traumatized. There is no traumatized person whom Christ cannot relate to, and who though they cannot relate to Christ with. And so Christians are able to bring their trauma, their traumatization, the deep hurt, the deep pain, the psychological agony, and they can bring it to the cross knowing that their Savior intimately understands their pain and desires for them to live life and life abundantly. And so there's so much more that can be said there, but my encouragement here is that the church needs to recognize, one, that racialized trauma, as well as all these other traumas, but specifically racialized trauma, not only exists, but it is a reality that Christ himself has experienced. And as a reality that Christ himself experienced, then there is a refuge and there is a safe place for Christians who have experienced racialized trauma. And that safe place is the throne room of grace, where Christ can heal. He can heal the deep wounds of racialization, and he can also heal the wounds of betrayal that exist due to the indifference that other people who make up the church, or the ward for that matter, have had towards those who have been racially traumatized. Thank you so much for listening to this. If you want to hear more, feel free to check out my podcast on iTunes. It's available on iTunes or any other major podcast catcher. Just search Quorum Deo Podcast. Please leave a review, there as well. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this. And again, feel free to share and feel free to comment as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have any questions and even pushback, I'd love for you to comment on this video so I can engage with you on those things. Grace and peace in Quorum Deo.